Starting off at number 10 now, we have the General. In 2015, retired Fire Chief Jeffrey Keane came across evidence which he suggested was proof that he was Civil War General John B. Gordon in a past life. Yeah, not everyone can say that. While visiting a Civil War battlefield, he was inexplicably overcome with emotion and had trouble breathing. At one point, he even thought he was having a heart attack. A while later, he spoke to a psychic. As they talked, he felt compelled to say the words, "Not yet." For no reason. He didn't know why he said those two words. Later on though, he found a Civil War magazine, and while flicking through it, the words "not yet" in quotation marks sort of jumped out at him. It was quoting the words of General Gordon, who said them while telling his troops to stay back during a battle on the exact same part of the battlefield where Jeffrey felt like he was having that heart attack. The picture of the General in the magazine also looked a lot like him. It gets weirder though. When Jeffrey turned 30, he went to hospital with an immense pain in his jaw and face. No cause was found. Sure enough, when investigators looked through General Gordon's life, he was shot in the face when he was 30 years old. It could all be a coincidence, but it's pretty strange, don't you think? Next up at number 9 now, we have the Golden Age. Ryan Hammonds was a boy who, at the age of 4, began having nightmares of people and places he didn't recognize. After a few months, he began to describe the details of this. It sounded like he was remembering the Golden Age of Hollywood. Cindy became concerned that there was more to Ryan's nightmares than initially thought. Cindy looked through a book about Hollywood and was amazed when Ryan pointed to a man in a photo and calmly said it was him in a past life. A child psychologist interviewed Ryan and found that he accurately described about 55 details of the man in the photo, an actor and Hollywood agent who had died in 1964. One creepy thing that stood out was that first they thought Ryan had got the age of death wrong for this guy called Marty. He said that he was 61 when he died, the death certificate said 59, but it turns out that the death certificate was actually wrong and Ryan was right the whole time. How could he have known that? That's kinda weird. Coming in at number 8 now, we have the Grandfather. This is a story of a boy called Sam who was studied by Dr. Jim B. Tucker of the University of Virginia. Now when Sam was 4 years old, his grandmother died. On that day, his father brought out an old photo album. Sam had never seen a picture of his grandfather before. When Sam saw a picture of his grandfather's first car, he pointed to it and said, "That's my car." When they showed him a picture of his granddad and some of his friends from when he was a boy, Sam pointed right to his grandfather and said, "There I am." They told him, "No, that's your grandfather." He said again, "No, that's me." He then began to share a lot of details that were creepily accurate. One that stood out was when he turned to his mother one day and said that in his past life, as his grandfather, someone had turned his sister into a fish. They asked him, "Who?" He said, "Bad men." His grandfather's sister had actually been murdered and her corpse was dumped in a body of water. Is this proof of his reincarnation or a little bit of a stretch? I'll be interested to hear your opinions on this one. Next up at number 7 now guys, we have The Fire. This is the story of Luke Ruhlman, a 5-year-old boy who claimed to have lived a past life as Pam Robinson, an African American woman from Chicago who died in a fire at the Paxton Hotel in 1993. It all started when Luke was just 2 years old. He would talk about a woman called Pam. Eventually his mother asked him who this Pam woman was. He said he used to be her, but then he died and went to heaven. He saw God and then eventually God pushed him back down and he was a baby and then he was named Luke. More details came later. Luke's mother investigated all of this and found Pam Robinson, one of the 19 people who died in the 1993 hotel fire. Luke said that was him. I encourage you guys to read the full story and see for yourselves if there is anything to Luke's story of reincarnation. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Shanti Devi. When this Indian woman was 4 years old, she told her parents that her real home was in Mathura where her husband lived. Now Mathura was about 90 miles from her home in Delhi. Her parents tried to ignore her story, which frustrated Shanti so much that she ran away from home at the age of just 6 years old. She was trying to reach Mathura but was taken back before she could get there. She kept telling details of her past life though, telling people that she used to be married and that she died 10 days after giving birth to her child. Eventually her headmaster at school found a man in Mathura who said this story matched that of his wife who had died. Her name was Ludgi Devi. He too became convinced that Shanti Devi was the reincarnation of his wife. Shanti never married and continued to tell her story for the rest of her life. Coming in at number 5 now, we have the murder. Karanfil Tutuzmas was 2 days away from the birth of her son in 1958 when she had a dream one night. In the dream, she saw a man whose face was covered in blood entering her room. She asked him why he had come and told him to leave as her husband was away. He told her that his name was Salim Fesley and that he had been shot in the ear. When she awoke, Karanfil remembered hearing about a man just like that in a nearby village who had been accidentally killed. She told her husband about the dream. Her husband said he actually used to know the man. The boy was born, and as soon as he began to talk, he insisted that he was the reincarnation of the man in the dream. Except he claimed his death had been no accident and that he had actually been murdered. At the age of 4, he went to the village and talked with the man's widow. He recounted their life together and told the woman that he, the reincarnation of her husband, had not been killed in a hunting accident, he had been murdered. The widow and her children visited the boy as he grew up and very much believed that he was the reincarnation of the man they all knew. Moving on to number 4 now, we have solving a murder. There wasn't too much to go on with this story, but I'll give it a shot anyway. In 2015, it was reported that a 3-year-old boy from Golan Heights had a long red birthmark on his head. He claimed that he had been murdered in a past life, that the mark was a sign of his murder. Dr. Eli Lask investigated the case. When they went to a city, the boy recalled his original first and last names and the names of his murderer. A local overheard all of this and said that the name of the man who the boy claimed to be had actually gone missing 4 years earlier. The boy was then able to find his old home. He walked right up to a man nearby and said, "I used to be your neighbor. We had a fight and you killed me with an axe." The man turned pale and the boy continued, "I even know where you buried my body." The boy led them to the burial site and also found where the axe was hidden. The man then confessed to the murder. Incredibly, the location on the man's skull where the murderer's axe hit was exactly the same place as the boy's birthmark. Next up at number 3 now, we have Anne Frank. Barbro Karlin was born in Sweden in 1954 to Christian parents. Around the age of 3, she told her parents that she was not Barbro, but actually Anne Frank. She stopped acknowledging them as her real parents and told them that her real parents would come and get her soon. As she got older, she told them details of her life as Anne. Around age 7 or 8, she became very confused when her school teacher began talking about Anne Frank in class. She wondered how the teacher could know all these things about her. That's when she found out that Anne Frank was already a very famous person by then who had lived before, a victim of the Holocaust whose diary became one of the most important books in history. When she visited Amsterdam for the first time, she walked straight to Anne Frank's house without directions. Inside the house, she was stricken with anxiety. She broke out into a cold sweat and grabbed her mother's hand. She told her mother that the movie star pictures were still on the wall. Her mother couldn't see any of these. That's when one of the tour guides told them that they had been taken down for the day to be mounted on glass and put back up. The story goes on and on. There have been countless books written about it if you're still interested to hear more, and it really is interesting. Moving on to number 2 now, guys, we have the Pollock twins. Mr. and Mrs. Pollock were a couple who lived in Hexham, England. In 1957, tragedy struck when their daughters Joanna, aged 11, and Jacqueline, aged 5, were killed in a car accident. Their parents were devastated. A year went by and Mrs. Pollock became pregnant. To their surprise, she gave birth to identical twin girls. They named them Gillian and Jennifer. Although they were identical, they had different birthmarks. Jennifer had a birthmark on her waist that looked just like a birthmark that Jacqueline had. She also had a birthmark on her head that looked like another one of Jacqueline's scars. The family moved when the twins were just 3 months old. 2 years later, the girls started asking for toys that belonged to their older sisters, even though they had never seen these toys before. Eventually, the family returned to Hexham. Despite being too young to remember that town, the girls knew all of the landmarks that only their sisters should have known. They were also scared of moving cars and kept telling their parents the car is coming to get them. After the age of 5, these memories began to fade and the girls led normal lives. And finally at number 1 now, we have Nazir Nazir Al-Danaf. In 2000, this boy's story was studied by Dr. Haraldsson, a psychologist from the University of Iceland. At the age of 1.5, he told his mother, "I am not small, I am big. I carry 2 pistols, I carry 4 hand grenades. I am a fearless, strong person. Don't be scared by the hand grenades, I know how to handle them. I have a lot of weapons, my children are young, and I want to go see them." The guns and grenade talk was pretty shocking as it was, but his parents didn't even know that he knew these words at this age. The boy also showed an unusual interest in cigarettes and whiskey. He asked them if he could go back to his hometown, which was 10 miles away. They had never been there. When they arrived, he directed them to a house and then jumped out of the car. He ran ahead with his father while his mothers and sisters talked to a local and told them about Nazi's reincarnation story. The man was stunned. The details matched his deceased father's story exactly. When Nazir returned, the man asked him questions about the house, which he all got correct. He got details about the family's history completely right too. He even found weapons on the property that he had stashed in his past life. They showed him a picture of the man who had died and asked Nazir who it was. He said, "This is me. I was big, but now I am small."
Alright, number 10, where it all began. We have to at least begin at the beginning. Slender Man first started back in 2009 when it made its first appearance on a website called Something Awful on June 10th of that year. It was posted by Eric Knudsen, 28 at the time, who went by the internet name of Victor Surge. It was supposed to be yet another entry into a paranormal image Photoshop contest, but no one expected what happened next. According to Eric, Slender Man was exactly that, a tall, thin, white-faced man with no facial features in a black suit. It had long arms that Knudsen said it would use to stalk young people and torment them with mind games. Soon, images and stories of Slender Man swept the internet, even earning deadly and dedicated followers, which we will discuss in detail later. As a result, many believe that Slender Man has actually been thought into existence through collective consciousness, that it has become a tulpa. A tulpa is an entity that is created in the mind and acts independently and parallel to your own consciousness. They are sentient beings who live in your head, but also live in the real world at the same time. So, while the initial beginning of Slender Man is fictional, there is just no guarantee that it remains that way. After all, as Dumbledore said, to make an entirely unrelated pop culture reference, just because it's happening in your head, why on earth should that mean that it is not real? Number 9, the Shadow Man. This first victim reports having been tormented by Slender Man his entire life and referred to him first as the Shadow Man. Many people who experience night terrors report seeing a tall, lanky shadow figure that torments them while in sleep paralysis. This guy first saw him when he was just 8 years old. While getting up to go to the washroom, they saw a tall, shadowy figure standing in the hallway. He reached out and beckoned to him with long, slender fingers. At some point, he worked up the courage to turn on the light, and the figure disappeared. 4 years later, it appeared again on his uncle's farm, standing in the highest window at the top of the building of the old barn, staring right at him. Then 2 years later after that, he appeared again, this time a lot closer. By this point, this person had developed sleep paralysis and it would happen fairly often. As they were about to drift off to sleep, there he stood at the end of his bed. They couldn't move or scream, and the figure just stood there watching him, waiting for something, until finally he burst up from the bed and Slender Man disappeared. But the sense that someone was watching him still remained and never went away. Number 8, trampoline. I mentioned previously that Slender Man became a kind of internet meme contest, but just how Slender Man became such a prolific urban legend remains unknown. Perhaps it's because of innocent sightings like this that make a more sinister explanation arise. Check out this clip.
After a record, when he played the video, he saw something like a Slender Man seeing him from his back.
I think what freaks me out about this video the most is how horror film-esque it is and how mundane. It was just a kid wanting to record his badass trampoline skills, but what he wouldn't have noticed while he was filming was the presence of something watching him. Considering the fanaticism around Slender Man, it is possible that predators could assume its identity to carry out evil deeds. I don't know, but I hope he's safe and that who or whatever that was never seen again. Number 7, 7-Eleven. apparently Slender Man loves a good Slurpee. This next story comes from a young woman from Oklahoma City. She was 15 years old at the time when her and her friend made a typical visit to 7-Eleven. Next to the convenience store there was a park with all of these weird statues. It was around 12:30 a.m. and usually it's an uneventful walk, but this time they saw an extremely tall figure, as tall as the branches in the trees nearby. It was dressed in black and extremely pale, sounds like Slender Man. Attempting to show no fear in the face of potential danger, she shouted at the person to see if she'd get a response, but to no avail. It just stood there, staring at them. I hate that. Needless to say, they booked it and referred to the being as Voldemort because that's kind of what it looked like. But then, years later, her friend informed her of the tales of Slender Man, and after seeing a picture she realized that's exactly what it looked like. Imagine? No thank you. Number 6. A cemetery sighting. This next story predates the whole Slender Man launch as well. This Reddit user reports a story that happened in her hometown before Slender Man was even launched. Reports of kids seeing a tall man in a suit walking around was already the stuff of legend where she lived. Her friend's older sister was skateboarding home one night and she had to pass the cemetery. Of course, there's a cemetery. Of course there is. As she went by, she kept seeing tall shadows following her, and she initially just wrote it off as a weird reflection of the light, you know, as you would. But then when she got home, she saw a creepy looking old man wearing a black suit standing in her backyard. She ran inside and looked out the window, but he had moved. He was already across the street under the trees, again, still looking at her. Stories like this were pretty common in her neighborhood, but it wasn't until the Slender Man story actually launched in 2009 that people actually got really scared. If stories like this actually exist and remain to be true, then here's my question. Since the way he tortures his victims is through mental manipulation, who is to say that the image of Slender Man circulating is a result of the creature's own grand plan? Number 5. Alone in the forest. This next story comes from Zach, who lives in Texas. This one creeps me out because it reminds me of the stories kids at school used to tell about the forest behind my school. While Zach was growing up, there was a big patch of forest behind his house. He used to play there all the time, but one evening made him question ever going back. Something was off about that evening, and so he began looking around. Off in the distance he saw a figure just standing there. It was impossibly tall, dark, with a featureless face, but somehow he knew he was staring right at him. Like a smart lad, everything inside him told him to run, and so he did. Follow your instincts, kids, okay? He was about a 7-minute run to his backyard, so he started sprinting, but no matter how fast he ran or where he went, the creature was always the same distance behind him. When he finally made it to the other side, he turned around and saw the creature stopped. He never saw the creature again, but years later, he started hearing about Slender Man and knew that's what he had seen. Number 4. Aaron Campbell. Aaron Campbell was a twisted young man obsessed with a wide variety of violent video games and just gore in general. He started out as they all do, by taking the lives of animals in vicious ways for pleasure. So when Aaron took the life of Alicia MacPhail on the island of Bute in Scotland, though shocked and horrified, no one could say they were surprised that Aaron was the perpetrator. Campbell was obsessed with anything that had to do with violence and was especially fascinated by Slender Man. This was just one of his fixations, and reportedly practiced voodoo while attempting to be YouTube famous. But his obsession with Slender Man finally became a reality. Alicia's death was gruesome to say the least, inhumane beyond belief. Thankfully, Aaron now sits behind bars for a minimum of 27 years, but honestly, hopefully forever. Number 3. House on fire. This next one was one of 3 crimes inspired by Slender Man and goes to show how dangerous obsession can be. In 2014, Lily Marie Hartwell walked to a park in the middle of the night. She carried with her a backpack full of knives, lighters, flashlights, cookies, and some water. Lily had just carried out an act brought on by an obsession with the tale of Slender Man. Unbeknownst to her mother and brother who were sleeping at home, she had just set her house on fire. Thankfully, the two escaped the fire with no mortal injuries, but their entire home fell to ash. According to police accounts, Lily confessed to having been obsessed with the creepypasta story of Slender Man. She tracked down story after story about the creature and kept journal entries mentioning murder and death. One particular entry is chilling to read, especially after such a horrific event. It reads, and I quote, "This keeps up, there will be no safety in this house," unquote. Lily was charged with arson and 2 attempted homicides. Weirdly though, Lily sent a text to her mom after the fact that read, "I'm so sorry mom, I don't know why I did it. Did any of you get hurt?" Like she was actually concerned. So it kind of goes to show that she was in a weird space and maybe she snapped out of it. Could it have been Slender Man? We don't know. Number 2. White mask. One of the key tropes of Slender Man that I mentioned previously is his ability to mentally torture its victims. So could that be the reason as to this next story? In 2014 in Cincinnati, Ohio, a mother who chose to remain nameless along with her daughter was returning home from work. Her daughter was waiting for her silently in the kitchen, wearing all black clothing and a white mask. Already we know who she's trying to imitate, and given the daughter's reported obsession with Slender Man, you get the idea. But next, the unimaginable happened. The daughter attempted to stab her own mother in the chest. The mother was able to thwart the attack, earning only minor defensive wounds. Apparently, her daughter had a history with mental illness, and Slender Man had become an obsession of hers. She had drawings, diary entries, and references to killing, and even made a whole world dedicated to the creature on Minecraft. The girl's fascination inspired her attack on her mother, but there was something very off with her daughter, stating to police, and I quote, "She was someone else during the attack." Number 1, last but not least, fatal followers. We had the infamous Slender Man trial. Morgan Geyser and her friend Anissa Vire were fanatic believers in a legend of Slender Man, and the consequences were almost deadly. In May of 2014 in Wisconsin, the girls made an attempt to show their dedication to this false idol by offering up a sacrifice. Their victim of choice was Peyton Leutner, one of their classmates. The two girls lured Peyton to a slumber party at their house and decided to play a game of hide and seek in the forest. During the game, the two girls got knives, pinned her down, and left 19 wounds and hit 2 major arteries. They fled the scene of the crime, and Peyton, being the utter badass that she is, dragged herself to a nearby road where she was saved by a nearby biker. Peyton lived to tell the tale, thankfully, and both Anissa and Morgan have been diagnosed with childhood onset schizophrenia. Morgan was charged with first-degree intentional homicide, which moved it to an adult court. Geyser was ordered to spend 40 years in a mental health institution, and Anissa was committed to a mental health facility for 25 years.
Coming in number 10, we have The Woman in the Cupboard, and this one is really strange, really odd. In 2000, a man in Japan became suspicious when food started disappearing from his apartment. So the man decided to set up cameras all around the place in the hope of catching whoever was doing this. When he got home the next day, he looked at the camera footage and he was very creeped out to see a woman walking around his house. He thought she was a burglar and she'd just come to steal some stuff when he was out, and so he rang the police. But when officers searched the place, they found a 58-year-old woman hiding in the top of a cupboard designed to store bedding and mattresses. What? This was just enough room for her to lie down, and she had been living in the cupboard the whole time, lying there perfectly still in the dark, just meters away from him, waiting for him to leave so she could use the house as if it were her own. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I think I'm going to do a quick check of every single cupboard in my house when I get home, and by quick I mean 10 hours. Next up at number 9 now, we have Armin Meiwes. This story is not really for those with a delicate stomach, so look away if that's you. In the early 2000s, Armin visited a little known website called the Cannibal Cafe. He posted a list looking for a well-built 18 to 25-year-old to be slaughtered and then consumed. His words, not mine. Yeah, normally young adults want good jobs, they want to travel, maybe find a partner and be slaughtered and then consumed, apparently. Amazingly, a few people actually replied and then backed out, presumably when they realized it was insane. But one man, Bernard Brandes, actually went to Armin's house. They then made a video of Armin cutting off his penis. He then tried to cook it and eat it, but it got burnt apparently, so he fed it to his dog. This happened. As Brandes bled to death in the bathtub, Armin gave him alcohol and 20 sleeping pills and then read a Star Trek book for 3 hours. He then kissed him and then killed him and then froze the flesh for 10 months while he lived off it and ground the bones into flour. Amazingly, he was only caught when he posted online the following year looking for his next meal and victim, and bragged about what had happened before. He is now serving life in prison. Moving on to number 8 now, we have the Silent Twins. Jennifer and June, the Gibbons twins from the UK, were known as the Silent Twins because they only ever talked to each other. Their sisterly love, and then there was this. The girls were absolutely obsessed with each other and gradually began to shun the community around them, who were not very welcoming to the girls. Eventually, they developed their own language and started communicating and committing crimes together, such as arson. This led them to be committed to a mental health institution for 14 years. June later said the whole thing went too far, and although we longed to be normal, we couldn't break out. It was too late, we were twins, but our personalities clashed. She wrote in her diary that her sister was a dark shadow, robbing her of sunlight. Now, psychologists deemed them deeply disturbed, and the girls felt so trapped, they said the only way that one of them could lead a normal life was if the other one died and freed them. The day after they were released from the institution, Jennifer died from a rare heart inflammation. June began to speak to others and went on to live a normal life for the first time. She wrote the epitaph on her sister's gravestone that read, "We once were two, we two made one. We no more two, through life be one. Rest in peace." Creepy. Coming at number 7, I'm Watching You. In 2015, a woman called Chelsea Clark from Toronto was watching movies in bed with her boyfriend. The next day, after work, she logged into her Facebook account and saw that she had a message from someone she didn't know. Now, Chelsea thought this was quite strange because her settings didn't allow messages from strangers. The message was titled, "Really Cute Couple." Chelsea opened it to find a guy with his profile picture as the Joker had sent pictures of her and her boyfriend in bed the night before to her. The account was deleted soon after, and police investigations have made no leads at the moment. So, next time you're watching something on your laptop, guys, maybe your tablet or your phone at night, someone could be watching right back at you. Next up at number 6, The Cemetery Clown. In 2015, Julie Graham and her husband were driving past Rose Hill Cemetery at night when they spotted a figure climbing over the cemetery gate. They captured this picture, but it wasn't until they looped back around that they realized it was a clown. They tried to get a bit closer for a better look, and that's when they saw him standing alone in the middle of the gravestones, slowly waving at them. And yes, that is the creepiest looking wave of all time. He didn't seem scared or bothered by them at all, but before the couple could even understand what was going on, the clown slowly turned around and walked into the darkness of the cemetery. Now, when police investigated all of this the next day, they found no signs of vandalism or disturbance in the graveyard, leading many people to wonder what the cemetery clown was doing that night and if he's going to be seen again. Coming at number 5 now, we have The Children. In the 90s, respected journalist Brian Bethel shared a story that changed his and many others' opinions on the paranormal. One evening, Brian said he was parked outside of a local movie theater and filling out a check for someone. Then he looked up to see 2 boys standing next to the car in the darkness, no more than 10 or 12 years old. Now, before they even spoke, Brian said he was gripped with fear. He couldn't explain why, and that it was just incomprehensible and soul-racking. Only one of the boys spoke, and they said they wanted to see a movie, but they had left their money at home and asked if Brian could give them a ride back to get their money. Now, Brian avoided looking at them because of the fear and instead looked up to see that the last show had already started and there was no way they'd make it back in time. The boy said it wouldn't take long. He said they were just 2 little kids. He said they didn't have a gun or anything. Now, that last sentence scared Brian the most, and as the feeling of terror consumed him, he realized his hand was already moving to unlock the door. That's when he looked up to see their eyes. They were deep, coal black. Brian quickly made his excuses, but as he tried to drive away, the kid started banging on the window and said,
"We can't come in unless you tell us it's okay. Let us in."
Okay, at number 4, we have Robert the Doll. Now, this doll was given to a boy, Eugene Otto, in 1904 by a Jamaican woman who worked with the family, who was supposedly a practicer of black magic and voodoo. She had supposedly cursed the doll because she was unhappy with how the family had treated her, and they soon reported hearing conversations between Eugene and Robert the Doll. At night, his parents would hear Eugene scream, and when they ran into the bedroom, they would find the furniture around Robert had been thrown around. When the family left to go on trips, the neighbors reported seeing Robert move from window to window of the house, and they would sometimes hear the doll let out a terrifying cackle. Over time, the house was sold on to a new family, but the doll remained there. The new owner, a 10-year-old girl, also screamed in the night and claimed that Robert would move, and at one time he even tried to attack her. These days, he sits in the Fort East Martello Museum in Florida and was the inspiration for the horror movie Child's Play. Moving on to number 3 now, we have Murder Castle. In 1886, pharmacist H.H. Holmes bought a number of properties in Chicago that left him owning an entire city block. He began renovating renovating them into a hotel. He would hire some workers for one part and others for a different area, so nobody really knew the full extent of the hotel's layout. It was finished just in time for the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, where people from all over the world descended on the city. But this wasn't a normal hotel. Almost every part of it was some sort of torture chamber. For most of that year, he trapped unsuspecting guests in their rooms to kill them. There were gas chambers and also rooms to suffocate people or starve them to death, as well as a hanging room. I'm not even sure what a hanging room means, but sounds pretty nasty. The whole building was designed to confuse the victims and give them a false sense of hope. There were staircases that led to absolutely nowhere and doors that were totally bricked off. Once they were dead, Holmes disposed of the bodies through a specially designed chute to dump them into the basement and then incinerate them in huge furnaces. He is known as America's first serial killer. Moving on to number 2, we have the real Leatherface. This is the story that inspired the movies Psycho, Silence of the Lambs. So, what real life story could produce such horror? It's the story of Ed Gein. This man had a disturbed obsession with his own mother, who had raised him during the earlier 20th century, with strict religious teachings about the sins of lust and desire. Now, after she died in 1945, Ed began to spiral into the life of a serial killer. At first, he would dig up bodies of recently buried females and cut off their body parts to keep as trophies before placing them back in the graves. Then he stepped it up and began a killing spree before police finally caught him. When they discovered the dismembered body of a woman in his farmhouse shed, investigators were also horrified by what else they found. A freshly cooked human heart was on the stove, ready to be eaten. He'd made drinking bowls out of their skulls, and the creepiest thing, I think, was what he had done with his victim's skin. He used them to make furniture, face masks, and women's clothes out of women's skin. I know the horror movie classics were inspired by this, but yeah, they can't really touch on how creepy this really was. And finally, at number 1, we have the death of Elisa Lam. Elisa was a 21-year-old Canadian woman who was visiting LA in 2013. She stayed at the Cecil Hotel in downtown LA and had been calling her parents every single day on her visit. But then on January 31st, the calls suddenly stopped, and her worried parents reported her missing to the police. She seemed to have just vanished out of nowhere. Then on February 14th, the police released this video of her behaving very erratically in the hotel elevator. She seemed to exit and then re-enter, and then started making some sort of gesture to something in the hallway outside. At one point, she simply crouches as if to hide from whatever is out there. Eventually, guests of the hotel started complaining about the water, saying it was black, foul-tasting, and had low pressure. Now, when staff went to investigate the water tank on the roof of the hotel, they found Elisa Lam's decomposing body. That's why the water was black. Oh god. The police don't know how she got onto the roof, which was locked and alarmed, or how she got into the tank and then replaced the lid from the inside, or what was going on in that elevator. Something really creepy. Some people think that this all points to a murder, others say it was supernatural in nature, that Elisa was actually possessed. Millions of people have now watched the infamous elevator video, and many people say something about it is very, very disturbing. Will it ever be solved? Starting off at number 10 now, we have the death. This one comes from Reddit user DQ Supervisor, who said, "Okay, this is going to sound crazy, but I can't find a better explanation. I was driving down County Road 28 just outside of my city. The road is basically a straight line for a bit, and I watched a car driving toward me in the opposite lane. It had blue headlights, and as it got closer, I saw that it was a black two-door car. As the car got up to me, it hit me head on. I saw my windshield smash, I saw the car roll over mine, I smelled the smoke, I felt all of the pain. I closed my eyes, I think I died. Then I opened them again, and I was in the same spot as I was less than about a minute before this person hit me. I saw the same car with the same blue headlights. As it got closer, I saw it was a two-door black car. I was freaking out because this car had just hit me a minute before, but it just kept on driving past and did not hit me. I 100% believe that that car did hit me. I will be finding another way to drive home from now on. Has anybody else experienced this? I do not have another explanation. All input and questions welcome. I must have got pushed from that universe into this one. Maybe not. I don't know anything about this stuff, but nothing else makes sense." At the number 9 spot now, we have The Passengers. This one came from Mark of Shame on Reddit. For some reason, this one felt really real to me. They said, "Driving home on a storm day, day, I see that a side road up to the local golf course is blocked off by flashing barricades. I also spy a Mercedes parked past the barricade with its hazards on. I stop and walk up to the car to see if they need help. I'm an EMT. I shine my light into the back seat to see a man slumped over, apparently asleep. Thinking I've got a few drunks, I move up to the driver window and rap on the glass and shine my light in. The driver is sitting bolt upright, unmoving, staring straight ahead. My window wrapping or light doesn't cause him to blink, flinch or move. I look over and the passenger is slumped forward onto the dash. This begins to creep me out. I call down to the sheriff's station and request a code 2 unit up to my location to help me check them out because the doors are locked. While on the phone, I walk back to the truck to get my go bag. As I'm on the phone with dispatch, she asked me to get a license number for the car just as a PG&E cherry picker truck comes rumbling down from up the closed road. I move to go around the truck to get the plate number and the car is gone. I talked to the driver of the truck and he said there was an 80-foot tree down across the road and that he didn't think it to be open for at least a day or so. So the question is, where the hell did the car go? Tree up one way, barricades down the other. It's kept me a bit unsettled when stopping at accidents and hazards ever since then. Coming at number 8 now, we have changing faces. Reddit user eerie1 commented in a parallel universe thread saying that for a single day his parents' faces swapped. People obviously asked for more details. He said, I woke up in the morning and at first I didn't realize anything was weird because it was like 6 AM and I was still half asleep. But after showering for school and waking up a bit, I noticed that there was something weird about my mom. Then I realized it wasn't my mom, it was my dad, but he had my mom's face. I was gonna say something, but then my little brother got up and was like, good morning dad, like everything was normal. Then, before I had time to process everything, I had to leave for school. Everything was fine at school and I almost forgot all about it. But when I got home, I saw my dad again, still with my mom's face. Then my mom walks in and starts talking to him, and she has his face. At this point, I am just dumbfounded. I have no idea what's going on. So I just sit down and start doing my homework. And when my little brothers get back from school, they just act like nothing is wrong. So I just decided to go with it and not say anything at all. I mean, I didn't want them to think I was going crazy or anything. I woke up the next morning and everything is just back to normal, but I still have dreams about it sometimes. Moving on to number 7 now, we have The Garden. This is a strange one that comes from Stefan1403, whose story involves 3 generations of his family. He said, it was summer and my grandfather, grandmother, mom and I were working in the garden. It's pretty big and there's a lot of grass to be mowed and stuff like that. After all the work, my mom would always ask me to go and get some soda because everyone was thirsty from working. It was in the evening, but still pretty warm. After everyone had their soda, my mom asked me to put it in the back of the fridge, which was in the basement. Used as a living area, only a small part of it is really storage. So I go to the basement, and please note, the room with the fridge is like 20 or 30 seconds from the exit, and you have to pass 2 doors with those flappy anti-fly curtains. I put the soda in the fridge, close the fridge, and walk out. Seems normal, right? Except I had to do this 3 times. The soda kept reappearing whenever I put it in the fridge and turned my back on it. Everyone was outside and there was only 1 bottle of soda in the whole room. To this day, I am still confused over what exactly happened. There have probably been more moments like this in my life, but this is the one that I remember the most. At the number 6 spot now, guys, we have crossed wires. This one involves answering machines, hopefully. Some of you guys aren't too young to even know what they are. The story comes from Reddit user Kill All Extremists. They said, this happened about 15 years ago. I called my friend up and he wasn't home, so I left a message on his answering machine. I said, hey, it's me. Sorry I missed you. Call you later. Bye. And then I hung up and left the house. I made no other calls. Later that day, he called back and he says, wow, that was quite a message you left. Who was that girl you were talking to? I was like, what are you talking about? I wasn't talking to any girl. Well, as it turns out, the message didn't end after I said bye. I actually had to go over to his house and listen to this message a few times for myself. After my initial message that I did leave, as I already quoted, there was a slight pause and it continues on for another 30 to 40 seconds or so with me talking to some girl. It was my voice, but a conversation I never had with a girl whose voice I didn't recognize. You could compare it to the the message I know I did leave, and the two voices were indistinguishable. Not just the voice, but talking mannerisms. It was my voice. Also, references to my occupation and activities were the same. Basically, in this conversation I was talking to this girl about going skiing, but I had to go down to my shop and work on a car first, which totally correlated to me. Then the message just stopped. It was recorded on one of those digital answering machines that recorded the message to a chip, so there was no tape I could have taken and had analysed, unfortunately. Also, neither I nor my friend had party lines, so that's not an explanation. It was very freaky and I just can't explain it. Moving on to the number 5 spot now, we have the closet. To get to Narnia, you have to go through the wardrobe. Everyone knows that. Do they also lead to other parallel worlds though? Reddit user Meanest Flower said, "In my parents' bedroom was this really large master closet. It was technically just one closet, but it had 2 doors going into it. Between the 2 doors was a high shelf and a hanging rod for clothes, so it functioned like 2 separate walk-in closets, but you could walk from one to the other by ducking under any clothes hung in the middle. One night, she was in her side of the closet and she saw through the gap between the shelf and the clothes rod my dad walk into his side of the closet. She heard the metal coat hanger sliding as he looked for something to wear and saw the clothes in the middle sway as they were brushed from side to side. From her side of the closet, she started talking to him about something random. Then she heard the bathroom door open. She poked her head out of the closet to see my dad clearly just emerging from the shower. He walked to look into his side of the closet and nothing. And up until the moment she poked her head out to look at the bathroom door, she would swear to you she could still see my dad in that closet." Next up at number 4 now, we have the money. This one comes from Reddit user ShadowJack00. The story is actually from a friend of theirs. They said, "A friend of mine from Toronto was in a bar in New York on a business trip. As he paid for drinks and food a few times during the night, he noticed a woman watching him intently. After a while she came over and struck up a conversation with him. Eventually she commented that she noticed he had coloured money in his wallet. She seemed, as he put it, eager to the point of being afraid to mention it. He told her yes, he was Canadian and he had some Canadian money in his wallet. She demanded he show her, and so he did. She was apparently very disappointed and started to cry a bit, but refused to talk about it any further. Feeling bad, he tried to cheer her up and the two of them got a bit hammered together. He admitted that his goal was to not spend the night alone, but he did anyway. At one point, he asked her why she wanted to see his Canadian money, and after a lot of coaxing and more drinks, she told him. She said that up until a few months before, US money had always been different colours. Ones were green, 10s were blue, and 100s were brown. She couldn't remember the other colours, she told him. She said the colours were not bright like Canadian money, but were sort of a set of dark tints. She said the brown 100s were called bricks because the brown tint they had was similar to a brick. Then she said one day they were all green, and she was the only one who seemed to remember them being different colours. My friend pressed her, and she said there were other differences too, not just money that she noticed. Popular TV programs were different or had the wrong actors in the lead roles. There was more, but my friend couldn't remember what else she said. After a while, she just started crying, saying she finally thought she had found someone who would convince her she wasn't going crazy, and he turned out to be a Canadian instead. Shortly after, she left, and that was the end of that. Moving on to number 3 now, guys, we have Quantum Thief. Now that has to be possibly the coolest name I've ever given to a story on this channel. I bet that will be a movie title one day. Anyway, this one comes from Reddit user Naimaz, who said, "Ever since I was a kid, I have what I call doubling occasionally happen around me. I put something in a pocket, then later find it in another pocket, as well as the original in the original pocket that I put it in. And yes, it has happened to money before. The most standout example was when I was a teen at camp. All the leaders had engraved plastic name tags, and we were issued only one. I used to keep moving mine between my hat and my shirt. At the end of camp, I just crammed all my stuff in a duffel bag and headed home. Later, when I unpacked, the first thing I do is to pull out my hat with the tag on it. Okay, so that's where I had it last, I thought. And of course, a minute later, I pull out a shirt with the same name tag pinned to it. I also experienced a similar phenomenon when I was a kid. For a few years it happened on a daily basis, but haven't seen it in a long time now. Someone would place something in their pocket or backpack, but when they went to grab it later it would be missing. I would then reach into my backpack or pocket and pull the item out. I initially got accused a lot of being a thief, but when it happened repeatedly, when I hadn't even been within 20 feet of the victim, my friends and classmates stopped doing so and just kind of accepted that that would always happen around me. Next up at number 2 now, we have pancakes. This is a very recent one posted to Reddit by user Julesmer, who said, when I was around 7 or 8, I distinctly remember going to a restaurant and getting a plate full of fruit and then heading back to my hotel and went to the hot tub. My sister Alex and I were talking about the activities we had done that day, and before we knew it, we headed back to our room. Our parents were at the casino and had left us pancakes and a note saying they'd be back in a few hours. We went to bed and had this dream that there was a bunch of lights with my sister's voice in the background. When I had awoken, me and my sister were in a cabin in a completely different state. I went to wake up my sister and I told her about my dream. It turns out we both had the same one, but instead of me hearing her voice, she heard mine. We both had no clue what to do, so we walked around. There had been a hot tub near our cabin and the same lady working at the other restaurant. We had talked about going to the fruit bar with our parents and had asked them if we drove to a different place while we were sleeping, but they just gave us a strange look and asked us what we were talking about. To this day, me and my sister still talk about what happened that night and think of new theories to explain what happened to us. And finally, at number 1 now, we have Janet's dead. It would be pretty terrifying if someone your family thought was dead just walked into your home. It would be even more terrifying though if you were the only one who realized it. This Reddit user said, last night I was on the phone with my mom and she told me to come over for dinner. Everything was going great. Then suddenly she comes out with, Janet is going to be there. I was like, very funny mom, great one. But in my head I was thinking, that's really not funny. Why would you say something like that? Then my mom keeps going on with this. You haven't seen her in forever. It'll be nice. Janet died last year though. I have a vivid memory of it. I did not attend the funeral, but I remember everyone talking about it and making a scene of it because she died young. She died of cancer, and I remember her husband coming to visit and being very depressed. I never saw her body or anything, but I am 1000% certain this woman is dead, and I remember many family members talking about it. I never saw the body or visited her grave, and I wasn't that close with her, so I never had much grief over it. But I have vivid memories of her dying and my relatives being depressed over it. I was really weirded out by my mom on the phone, and finally I came out and said, Janet's dead, what are you talking about? And my mom just kept talking like it was ridiculous or like I was kidding around. She jokingly said, she's back, or something like that. I asked my dad later on and he looked at me like I was insane. I also can't find the obituary online, but I never looked for it to begin with.
Starting off this list, in our number 10 spot, we have Barbro Karlin. A woman named Barbro Karlin was born in 1954 in Sweden, and by the time she could talk, she began telling her parents some pretty frightening stories. She said she could remember men kicking down the door of her home and taking her away, which is obviously quite a frightening memory for a child to be having, and one that certainly never had happened in Barbro's life at that point. She also told them a name that means a lot to us all now, but at the time her parents had no idea who this person was. That name was Anne Frank. Anne Frank, of course, passed away in a concentration camp in 1945 after hiding in an attic with her family, trying to avoid persecution for being Jewish. Just 10 years after Anne's passing, she wasn't well known like she is today, but when Barbro was 10 years old, they took her to Amsterdam and she was able to lead them to Anne's home with no directions at all. She was then able to identify a spot on the wall where Anne had hung photos up, and she also told her parents that the steps in the home were different than she had remembered them, which held up with the history of construction that the house had already gone through. By the time she was 16, she was already writing books and poetry, and she had actually ended up going on to befriend a close relative of Anne's named Buddy Elias. Whether Barbro is a real and true reincarnation of Anne is of course to be proven for sure, but I definitely do like the idea of Anne connecting with people from her life and also having a much better life this time as Barbro. In our number 9 spot today we have Lee. Before I dive into this one, guys, don't forget to hit that thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video. It does really help us out, we appreciate it. When a child named Lee was only 2 years old, he began talking about his other house with his other mom. This would certainly be quite concerning to any parent, and by the time he was 3, he was claiming that his birthday was on June 26th, even though it
was not. This continued on and Lee's claims grew and grew. He began to give even more information on what he remembers as his past life, saying that his middle name was Coe, he wrote movies for a living, he had a daughter named Jennifer, and that he had passed away at the age of 48. This is all pretty crazy for a toddler to be explaining, but instead of being frightened, Lee's parents began inquiring more and asking him even more questions. They wanted to know which movie he had written, as to possibly figure out who their son believed he had been before. His parents began to ask him titles of different movies to see if any rang a bell, and when they asked him about Gone with the Wind, Lee got very excited and said that he had definitely written that one. Lee's parents obviously quickly googled the movie to find more information, and this is when they found out about the movie's writer, Sidney Coe Howard. Sidney, of course, had the correct middle name, his birthday was June 26th, he did have a daughter named Jennifer, and he did pass away at the age of 48. My initial reaction is that his parents had possibly unknowingly fed him this information, but apparently this Google search was the first time his parents had heard any of this information, aside from hearing it from their child. This is certainly quite a crazy story, and one that may possibly have me convinced. In our number 8 spot today we have Sergei Torop. Sergei is also known as Vissarion, and he is a Russian mystic and leader of the cult Church of the Last Testament. He also claims that in August of 1990, when he was 29 years old, he had a revelation that he was in fact the reincarnation of Jesus Christ, and this led to him starting a cult. How convenient! As the leader of the cult, he is said to teach reincarnation, veganism, and harmonious human relations, predicting the end of the world. This doesn't sound too bad except for the whole thing about being Jesus, but here's the kicker. He was arrested in September of 2020 on charges of running an illegal religious organization, as well as for causing harm to others and extortion. Also, if you go on his Wikipedia page and look under the personal life section, you'll see some other weird stuff I really can't talk about on YouTube, but definitely earned him a spot on today's list. In our number 7 spot today we have James Leninger. James Leninger was only 4 years old when he began to recount events from his past life. He swore that he had been a World War II pilot that had been shot down over Yojima. These memories first came back when James' parents found him one night after he had woken up from a nightmare yelling, "Airplane crash, plane on fire, little man can't get out." James explained that his name in his past life was also James, and that he had flown an aircraft called the Natoma. His parents did some research after these claims and found out that there was an aircraft carrier during World War II called the Natoma Bay, and there was a pilot who had been killed in action in this plane over the Pacific named James Houston. They began to ask him questions about his past life, including questions about the airplane that would be truly surprising for a small child to have answers to, like when his mom referred to an object on the bottom of a toy plane as a bomb, and James responded by correcting her, telling her it was a drop tank. Or when one day they were all watching a documentary on the History Channel, and the narrator of the show referred to a plane as a zero, and James said that was untrue and it was actually a Tony. I have no idea what any of this means, but apparently James was right both times. This is obviously a pretty unbelievable story, and many people think that James just took an interest in World War II and planes at a young age and had somehow been exposed to this information previously, but his parents swear that that just isn't true. In our number 6 spot today we have Jim Jones. Jim Jones is certainly one of the most well-known people on this list for all of the wrong reasons. He is the man who claimed that he was a reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, and Gandhi. That's a record. And he also founded the cult, which was originally called Wings of Deliverance, but he later changed the name to the People's Temple Full Gospel Church. After an expose in the New West magazine about the things going on in this cult, he ended up moving the group from the United States to Guyana. From here there were claims of horrible things and human rights violations, which led to an investigation. People found out that some of the supposed members of this cult were actually being held against their will. What a surprise. In the end, with all of this going on, Jim managed to convince his followers to take all of their lives in one massive, horrific event, and this day has gone on to become known as the Jonestown. A total of 918 people died that day, including Jim himself. In our number 5 spot today we have Jeffrey Keane. Jeffrey Keane had lived a lot of his life and was already retired when he started to believe in his past life. Jeffrey and his wife went on vacation to Maryland when they visited a battlefield from the Civil War that was called Sunken Road, and that is when he became overwhelmed with emotion. Apparently the emotion was so strong that he truly thought he might have been having a heart attack. After this emotion passed and he was able to gather himself, he he still felt an unbelievable connection to this place. At a later date, he encountered a psychic at a party and had relayed this history to them. The psychic asked if he believed in reincarnation, and Jeffrey felt like he had to reply with the words, quote, "not yet." After this day, Jeffrey was reading a Civil War magazine when he came across a Civil War general named General Gordon. General Gordon had fought at Sunken Road, and during this battle he was known for constantly shouting the words, quote, "not yet." This of course caused Jeffrey to do more research into the general, where he found out even more connections, such as how on his 30th birthday, Jeffrey had to go to the hospital with a random, really terrible jaw pain, and when General Gordon was 30, he was shot in the jaw. Or how General Gordon had suffered certain injuries and Jeffrey had unexplained marks on his body in the same spots. This could all be a coincidence, but it definitely is a very interesting story regardless. In our number 4 spot today, we have Alan John Miller. Alan is an ex-software manufacturer turned founder of the Jesus cult. Alan himself claims that he is actually the reincarnation of Jesus, and his partner is the reincarnation of Saint Mary Magdalene. Thank goodness these two were able to somehow find each other. Alan holds, quote, divine truth seminars where he teaches what he refers to as the divine love path, which focuses mainly on emotional clearing. Alan has even gone as far as to give doomsday predictions, which he said could start as early as 2012, which, I mean, 10 years later we all know simply did not happen. Alan believes that the movement of tectonic plates will cause severe earth changes, and they will result in a dramatic rise of the oceans. Apparently on his website he said, quote, both the east and west coasts of Australia will be underwater about 100 meters deep. In our number 3 spot today, we have Michael Trevesser, also known as Wayne Bent. This guy was the leader of what is called as the Lord Our Righteousness Church in New Mexico. In 2000, he claimed that he himself was the Messiah. He predicted that the world would end in 2007, which again, I can confirm was not true, and he stated that God had said to, quote, stay with me one more year, but a year later he was arrested for some of the most horrific crimes that I cannot even mention here on YouTube. Not only this, but he also admitted and acknowledged doing similar crimes before in the past, like it was just no big deal. He then went on to compare himself to Jesus Christ, and he told the media, quote, the current upheaval over me and the present contest is well underway. It was the same for Jesus. Jesus had not committed any crimes, so the authorities had to invent some crimes to crucify him over. It is the same for me also. I have committed no crimes, but many crimes are being imagined and concocted in the minds of men to try and kill me again. In our number 2 spot today, we have Sergey Benhayan. Sergey is an Australian bankrupt tennis coach who believes he is the reincarnation of famous Italian artist and scientist Leonardo da Vinci. This would be fine, except Sergey is also the founder of a pretty harmful cult called Universal Medicine, which has been criticized for its extremely unorthodox practices and the fact that he has 0 medical qualifications, the most important part. He not only has some extremely creepy and questionable practices that he says led to the curing of cancer, but his relationship workshops that cost tens of thousands of dollars have mostly led to divorce. How surprising. He also involves his daughter Natalie, and she claims that she can communicate with a woman's ovaries. No thank you. Do not talk to them. A New South Wales Supreme Court jury even found that it was true that he leads a socially dangerous and socially harmful cult. In our number 1 spot today, we have James Gibson. A man named James Gibson has an extremely troubled past and is actually a killer, which is truly never good, but he also believes that he is the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. I feel like even if you really felt like this, that might just be one secret that I personally would keep to myself forever, but James, I guess, feels a little differently. James really did have a difficult childhood and upbringing, which is quite sad. He lost his dad at a young age to the Black Saturday bushfires and had quite a troublesome time as a teenager. In 2015, he attacked and killed a man named Glenn Sullivan, and when asked why he did it, he said, quote, he killed my dad. I saw it in the smoke. James explained to his psychiatrist about his reincarnation belief, and he also explained that the German soldiers were controlling him and had ordered him to kill someone so that they could find him and recognize him so that they could come and retrieve him. All in all, James has obviously had a rough go. The things he's done cannot be excused, but I do hope he has received some help and maybe some treatment for everything he's got going on. Starting off in our number 10 spot, we have T. time. This story comes from someone who has a very strange memory from when they were around 9 years old. They were eating dinner in their room for some reason that they can't quite remember. What they do remember, however, is being sat at their dresser, which had a big mirror. While sitting there, the storyteller's dad came in to check on them and asked if they wanted more tea, to which they replied yes. They picked up their empty teacup and handed it to him and watched as he walked out the door. In the next instant, they looked back over and saw their same teacup, completely full of tea, right where they had just picked up the one that was empty. They of course asked their dad about this after, because what in the world is going on, and their dad said that he never came into their room at all. This story is bizarre for sure, but there's also something really eerie about it as well. I can totally see why this was one that really stuck with them. In our number 9 spot today, we have the hotel room. This story starts out with the storyteller explaining that this strange story happened when they were on a family road trip. They write, quote, "We stayed at a hotel for a night. Our room was nothing more than 2 beds and a restroom with a big mirror across from the beds. Everyone went to sleep but me. I stayed up playing a mobile game I was addicted to at the time. At about 2 a.m. I went to sleep. When I woke up, I noticed something was just ever so slightly off. The mirror was gone, the room had 2 separate bedrooms, and there were 3 beds. Apparently I was the only one who noticed it because my family called me crazy. Still confused to this day as to what happened." It's the small changes like this that would have me absolutely freaking out, because it seems small but you know something is off and different. I don't blame them for still remembering this day and questioning what exactly happened here. In our number 8 spot today, we have a new phone. Okay. This one wouldn't be the weirdest one in the world, but it has to do with the lost phone, and I just can't get over how strange the place they found it was. So they write, quote, "My friend and I were talking to our roommate and her girlfriend one night. Roommate had just received her new phone and was sitting in bed using it while the 4 of us chatted. So roommate sat her phone down while we were all still chatting. She goes to pick it back up and it's gone. Like, she had just put it down for a few minutes tops before she noticed that the thing had poofed. I call it for her and we can't hear it. We take the comforter and the sheets off the bed, shake them all out. We look under the bed, behind it, everywhere we can. That phone is gone. Even though we hadn't left her room at all during our conversation when the phone disappeared. We tore apart the whole apartment trying to find it. Finally, we decided to try her car. It was locked in the trunk. We live on the 3rd floor and we were all in the same room watching her use it before it somehow teleported. There's something about finding anything in a locked trunk that seems kind of eerie and creepy, and couple this with how the whole thing is seemingly impossible, and you've got a lot of unanswered questions here. In our number 7 spot today, we have a server's nightmare. This story starts out with someone explaining that it comes from a time many years ago when they worked as a server at a restaurant. The memory begins with the quintessential server panic experience, where their coworker forgot to punch in the food order for a 3-top. If you work in the service industry, you know the absolute panic that sets in, especially if you're like me and never write things down. You can't go back and ask these people what they had when their food should already be out and on the table. It's a panic like none other. Anyway, so this coworker not only forgot to punch in the food, but also of course forgot what the order was. This storyteller was laughing at their stressed coworker, who was obviously trying to figure out what to do, and while laughing at him, the storyteller threw out a random order at them. They said, quote, "It was probably fried mozzarella, a cheeseburger with no onions, and chicken fingers." While the storyteller was joking and just having fun, it turns out that somehow this was the exact order that the table had ordered and the person needed. It totally freaked the storyteller out, and they even made their coworker let them run the food to the table to make sure that he wasn't making it up. Turns out the storyteller was right and probably saved their coworker a lot of stress and hassle. In our number 6 spot today, we have the camp photo. This story comes from someone who has always remembered this strange thing that happened years ago when they were 12 years old and at camp. They explained that they were taking a photo on a disposable camera because cell phones were still in the flip phone phase, and considering the fact that they were 12, even if they weren't, it's not like they had a cell phone anyway. So with this disposable camera, they were taking a picture of 2 of their friends that they had made while at camp. This is all fine and well, of course, and honestly very cute, but it's what's seen in the photo that really has stuck with this person. They explained that in the photo, one of the friends appears twice in 2 entirely different poses. They explain that it still weirds them out every time they come across it. In our number 5 spot today we have Employee of the Month. This story comes from someone who almost had a premonition of sorts. They explain, quote, "I was sitting in my office one day when my desk phone rang, and it is my undersheriff asking me to bring him all of the reports, dispatch logs, any documentation reference to a specific case, so I get it all together and start towards his office. I meet him in the hallway and hand him the paperwork. He asked me what it was. I told him it's the blank documentation you asked for. He then swears he never asked me for it, that he had just arrived and had not called my office. He was on his way down the hall to ask me to get it together." I mean, at the very least, I hope he gave this person a raise, because while this certainly was a weird experience, that's also the most efficient employee I've ever heard of. I hope that's not the new work standard though. Like, what do you mean you didn't anticipate my needs? In our number 4 spot today we have The Repeater. This story is one that only lasted for about an hour, but it definitely was a strange and confusing hour for the person who experienced it. Basically, it started when they were watching TV with friends, and they ended up landing on some sort of old 80s movie that they used to watch many years prior, but hadn't seen in quite some time. All of the dialogue from the movie came flooding back to them, and they remembered what each character was going to say next. Not so weird, our brains work in mysterious ways. This, however, seemed to open some sort of gate, because when they changed channels and were trying to find something new to watch, this person was now able to recite every line of dialogue prior to it being said, as if they had memorized it all, but this time it was with shows they had never seen before in their life. This then translated into them being able to predict what their friends were about to say right before them saying it. Again, this strange effect only lasted for about an hour before things returned to normal, but what a strange hour that would have been. In our number 3 spot today we have The Inside Scoop. Maybe this is a parallel universe story, or maybe this person is just a bit of a clairvoyant or something of that nature, but whatever you want to call it, this story is definitely a weird one. They write, quote, "Sometimes I'll be talking to someone I've never met, and very specific facts about them will pop into my consciousness out of nowhere, like this person had a golden retriever that died in 2009. Then they'll inevitably bring up the fact that I mentioned without me saying anything first, sometimes seconds later, sometimes years. This would be so strange and also so hard to navigate. You'd have all these things you seemingly happen to know about this person, and now you have to avoid bringing them up until they do. It's like knowing someone's secret. That would be really weird. If you had this sort of ability, would you tell people or would you keep it to yourself?" In our number 2 spot today we have The Wake Up Call. This story comes from someone who is explaining a very scary moment that their brother experienced that is kind of unexplainable. They start off by saying that it doesn't seem as though their mom believes this story, but they definitely do. Most of that is because they saw their brother after this incident and could definitely tell that something had seriously spooked him. They write, quote, "He was sitting in the passenger seat driving home alongside my mom. A bright green car swerved and hit them, knocking bits and pieces of glass into his arm. He jolted awake afterwards, just in time to see the green car pass them. He claimed he felt the marks the glass left afterwards too." So basically, this guy might have somehow been in a reality where this accident really did happen, and then was able to jump realities to one with a better outcome. Or perhaps he was just temporarily transported to the other one before jumping back into this one. The possibilities really are endless when it comes to the multiverse, and I can totally understand how an experience like this would have somebody pretty shaken up. Whatever really happened here, I'm just glad that this person somehow ended up in the timeline where everything is a-okay. In our number 1 spot today we have The Boiler Repairs. This story is a bit of a longer one, but it's so strange and truly like nothing I've ever heard before. It absolutely shocked me. This person wrote, quote, "This didn't happen to me, but to my dad. He works for a heating and air conditioning company, so he often has to go out to people's houses to fix things. About 5 years ago he told me he had a bizarre dream where he went on a call to an elderly woman's house. He'd never seen the house or this woman before, but he said it was bizarre because of how realistic the whole thing felt. He fixed her boiler in the dream, chatted for a bit, and then left. About a week later his company gets a call from an elderly woman needing her boiler fixed. They sent my dad on the job. When he arrived, he said it was the exact same house from his dream and the same old lady. He knew her name before before he even had to ask, and knew his way around the house without having gone inside yet. When she opened the door, she said, "Hi Gary," and when he asked how she already knew his name, she said she had a dream last week that her boiler broke and that my dad is the one who came to fix it, so she just knew that would be his name. Two complete strangers never having met each other had the exact same dream that they would meet each other, and they did. The whole thing is so crazy. That would be so strange, but also so cool. It's almost like they were destined to meet each other in some way. Honestly, the unexplainable can be terrifying, but it can also be kind of nice and cool and truly mystifying. All I want to know now is if Gary and the elderly woman kept in touch.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have the Draugr. To the Vikings, these creatures were the walking dead. They are mentioned throughout Viking and Icelandic mythology. It's easy to compare them to our concept of zombies, but I think they were more terrifying than that. Although dead, the Draugr retained some level of intelligence. They weren't just undead, they were sentient. The Vikings believed they were created by a curse, or sometimes just the will of the dead person who simply refused to die. They called the tombs and graves of the dead their homes, especially ones with lots of treasure inside. Vikings who dared to plunder this treasure would be wary of the Draugr, who jealously guarded it. If a Viking decided to try and fight one of them for the treasure, they'd have to deal with their superhuman strength, their ability to just increase size at will, and the overpowering stench of decay. Some of you may have fought your fair share of these in Skyrim, but would you like to face one in real life? I'll leave that with you. Moving on to number 9 now, we have Odin's Eye. If you're a big fan of Norse mythology or the Marvel Universe, you may be aware of Odin, the Allfather, the supreme deity. You'll also be aware that he famously has only one eye. The other socket where there used to be an eye is covered up with an eye patch. Odin is known to represent both war and poetry. He's a leader, but also a hermit, a trickster and a protector. Most of the stories surrounding him are to do with wisdom, even the one about how he lost his eye. According to legend, Odin visited the mystical well of Urd at the base of the world tree that held the cosmos together. The well was guarded by Mimir, who became all-knowing by drinking the water in the well. Odin asked for a drink of the water. Mimir replied that in order to do that, he must sacrifice one of his eyes. Odin obliged. He gouged out one of his own eyes and dropped it into the well. Then, and only then, was he allowed to drink from the waters of cosmic knowledge. A gruesome way to gain wisdom. Next up at number 8 now, we have spacecraft. This was the Vikings' version of black magic. It was practiced by witches known as Seether, also known as spaewives. They were formidable black magicians who were said to live with trolls and all sorts of other dark creatures that lived in the shadows. Their magic could take many forms and would sometimes be too subtle for the Vikings to even notice until it was far too late. The spells could cause crop failure, disease in livestock, wasting illnesses and plague that reduced the Vikings to just walking skeletons. The most powerful of the Seether could cut down some of the great Viking heroes with spells as powerful as they were evil. They could change their own skin, conjure up trolls out of nowhere, call forth the undead, and ensnare the minds of the Vikings to do their bidding. The Vikings lived in constant fear of when a spacecraft spell might come to town. Next up at number 7 now, we have the Burning. This is the story of Ingjald, a legendary Swedish king. He was a hardy and fearsome leader, but he wasn't always that way. As a child, he was made to eat the heart of a wolf in an attempt to harden him and prepare him to be king. Well, it certainly did that, but it changed him forever. Ingjald became terribly cruel from that day on. He knew his evil deeds would be the end of him one day and decided to stay one step ahead of his rivals. He built a great feasting hall and invited 7 other kings to dine with him. During the meal, he went outside, locked the doors, and burned the hall to the ground. He waited with his men outside to cut down any survivors. He tried to cover this whole thing up, but the legend never forgot. He became known as Bad Ruler from then on. Eventually, he was overthrown and decided to not surrender, instead burning the building he was in to the ground. A fitting end for this cruel king. Moving on to number 6 now, we have the Kraken. This is a beast so terrible that it has survived into the modern era through stories passed down for generations. The Vikings believed the Kraken to be a giant squid or octopus-like creature. Its size was unimaginable, but some estimate it to be more than a mile long. Some Viking sailors actually mistook it for an island in the sea until they got really close and it reared its fearsome face. It rose up when the waters were disturbed by boats and would release its tentacles to flail above the water, smashing boats into splinters or pulling down sailors to their watery graves. Next up at number 5 now we have Love Triangle of Death. This story comes from a 13th century saga said to be about real events from the Viking era a few hundred years before. Gudrun was a woman who was married twice but divorced and widowed, all at an early age. She fell in love with the charming Kjartan. Before they began courting though, Kjartan's father believed that Gudrun was very unlucky and didn't want his son marrying her. In an effort to stop their relationship in its tracks, he sent Kjartan on a trading expedition to Norway. There, he was held hostage by the king. During his absence, Kjartan's cousin Bolli persuaded the reluctant Gudrun to marry him instead. When Kjartan returned, Gudrun realized she had made a terrible mistake. A bloodbath ensued. In the end, Bolli killed Kjartan, his own cousin and also foster brother. Kjartan died in his arms. Bolli was then killed in revenge. The tale that began with such promising love ended in nothing but death and pools of blood. Next up number 4 now we have Fenrir. The Vikings believed this was one of Loki's children. He is also a gigantic wolf and very angry. Even the name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard of him. In the old days, the prophecies foretold that Fenrir would only ever continue to grow in size and ferocity, and so the gods decided they had to bind him forever. They tried chains, but Fenrir broke them off with ease. The gods commissioned the dwarves to make Gleipnir, a tether as thin as a ribbon but stronger than a chain. They restrained him with that. When he realized he had been tricked, he bit the hand off the god Tyr. The Vikings believe that Fenrir won't stay bound forever and that he will one day return and kill Odin himself at the end of the world. And now we're going to talk about the beginning of the world. Moving on to number 3, we have murder creation. We talked about Odin earlier on. If you were wondering what else a god who gouged his own eyes out can do, look no further. The Vikings believed that the universe came forth from an empty void that separated worlds made purely of fire and ice. This was the home of Ymir. This all-powerful being was the mother and father of the Jotuns, chaotic beings who later became the enemies of the Norse gods. Eventually came 3 siblings, Vili, Vi and Odin. The 3 conspired to create the world that we live in and fill it with life. They needed something to create the world out of though, and they chose Ymir's body. Odin and his brothers murdered Ymir and made the world out of his body and the sky out of his skull. His blood became the sea, his bones and teeth became rocks and mountains, his brains became the clouds. The brothers then set about creating life. Humans and the intelligence that we have. For the Vikings, the world looks a lot different when you realize it was created through a horrific murder. Moving on to number 2 now, we have the end. The end. Perhaps I should have put this one at the very end. Anyway, this is the story of Ragnarok. I'm sure some of you have heard of it before. It's the event set in stone where the world as we know it will come to a fiery end. The Vikings believed that even the gods would be unable to escape the flames. They describe this time as an axe age, a sword age, a wind age, a wolf age before the world falls. They said that after 3 years of global suffering and plague, there would be a war in the heaven above. The Viking gods would do battle with the Jotuns, giant wolves, the world serpent and the infamous Loki. They would all fall and the fire giant Surt would burn the whole world to ashes. Perhaps most disturbingly is the fact that even though the Vikings have gone, this prophecy still remains. Some people today still believe these horrors await us. And finally, number 1 now, we have the sacrifice. This is the story of Domaldi, a legendary Swedish king. His tale is not a happy one. He became king when his 2 older half-brothers murdered their father Vispur and his stepmother cursed Domaldi with a life of bad luck. So, not a great start to being a king. It would have been easy to dismiss the curse as the words of a grieving person who wanted to lash out in the only way they knew how. After a while though, it seemed like the curse had some power to it. Domaldi's reign was plagued by, well, plague. After the first year of his people starving, the chieftains tried to appease the gods by sacrificing an ox. The harvest was still bad, the people were still starving. The following year, they began sacrificing humans. That didn't work either. Eventually, they realized the curse was linked to Domaldi, and so they killed their own king on an altar. The moment the blood touched the stone, the curse was lifted. The next harvest was abundant, and people spoke in whispers of the sacrifices that had to be made.
Starting off at number 10, A Child in the Water. So one woman shared her story from 2015. She was hunting for seashells with her children when a storm started coming in on the beach, and the waters were getting rough. Her eldest daughter's already left to go back to the cottage for lunch, so she escorted her 4-year-old to chase them and catch up. She herself continued searching for shells for another 20 minutes before the weather got worse. She started to make her own way back, but then had a sudden, inexplicable feeling of dread. She looked out into the water and saw her 4-year-old daughter drowning. She knew deep down that her youngest was safe back at the cottage, but she could also see the image of her daughter drowning in the waves. So she started wading into the water, thinking it couldn't be her, but she wasn't quite coming to her senses just yet. She had to fight her instincts to save her child, knowing she couldn't swim safely herself through the stormy waters, and then backed up. She ran back, crying, back to her cottage. At the door, that same daughter she swore that she saw drowning was waiting for her at the door, and she said that never in her entire life was she happier to see her daughter. She ended her account saying that she is convinced that the thing in the water was her daughter's doppelganger trying to lure her to her own death. Let's move to number 9, Bringer of Madness. The great French writer Guy de Maupassant had a lengthy experience with his own double. He lived between the years 1850 to 1893, and towards the end of his life he claimed to have regular visits with his doppelganger. Apparently, it would talk and interact with him. It wasn't unnerving until Maupassant was working on his story, The Horla. His doppelganger came in and casually sat next to him. Then, his double spoke out what the author was writing, which happened to be a story of a man being haunted by an entity. An entity that plans to turn him insane and take over his body. So Maupassant was spooked by this enough to call in his servant, and then the doppelganger vanished. Now, Maupassant went on to finish the story, but also he did tend to lose his grip on sanity himself. He was admitted into an insane asylum and passed away within a year of another despondent encounter. That last encounter was another visit of his double to his room, but this time the double just sat in his room and buried its face in its hands. Number 8. An unexpected passenger. Writer Victoria Brandon saw her own doppelganger during a near accident on the road. She rounded a curve on the highway and saw a huge truck coming towards her. It was driving on the wrong side of the road and she was right in its path. In that moment, she felt a suspension of consciousness and saw a double of herself in her passenger seat. Instead of sitting up, its head dropped forwards on its chest and its hands were folded passively. At the same time she saw this, she said some kind of saving reflex must have gone to work to wrench the car out of the path of the truck. It passed by inches away from her car that was pulled onto the gravel shoulder of the road. Her double disappeared and she loosened her white-knuckled grip on the wheel and then slumped in her seat, likely due to the stress of the situation. But then she realized she was then imitating the exact pose of the thing that was in her passenger seat earlier. Same head down, hands crossed. Brandon said she knew she should have been left feeling frightened from the incident with the truck, but what frightened her more was that the figure that was in her passenger seat just kind of creeped her out. In her words, it seemed indescribably malign and threatening. She imagined that the meekly bowed head had conceived an evil smile. On to number 7, another mother. So a girl saw a double of her mom walking around 2 separate times. The first was when she swore her mom went upstairs while on the phone, and so she went up to ask her mom a question, but her mom was on the back porch. And then her mom denied that she had been upstairs recently, so that just kind of threw her. And then the second time she thought she saw her mom was a couple weeks later, and she saw her mom come stand in the doorway of her room in a nightgown and just messed up hair, just staring at her. She looked down at her laptop again and then back up, and her mom was gone. So then she heard a noise in the bathroom and went to check. There in the bathroom was her mom, fully dressed in her clothes from earlier in the day, doing her makeup, and her hair looked great, not like a mess from earlier. So she asked her mom how she changed so fast, and in response her mom gave her just a really weird look. So fast forward about a month later, and her car is nearly T-boned in a car accident. She said they described it as if something moved the car sideways and away, so instead of hitting the passenger side of the car where her mom was sitting, it hit at a different angle, so the car flipped. So it flipped 3.5 times, but both of her parents that were in the car walked away with only minor injuries. As doppelgangers are known to sometimes be a harbinger of malicious things or bad or death, it's very lucky that it didn't end up that way. Number 6, Up in Smoke. So one woman was watching TV in her bedroom and the father of her son told her he was going to go outside for a smoke. About 5 minutes later, he comes back into the bedroom. He looks at her like she did something wrong. Then he goes to his dresser and looks for something within a drawer, and he shuts it quickly and then walks to the bathroom and slams the door shut. So she gets mad at him since their son is asleep and she's like, be quiet. She waits, looking at the bathroom door and waiting so she can kind of just chew him out for slamming the door. But then he, the real him, comes in through the front door of the apartment 10 minutes later. And so she's like, what? Could you open the door to the bathroom, please? And he does, and no one's there. And then he just goes in and does his business in the bathroom. But it freaked her out for a while, and still doesn't know what happened. Moving on, 3 great historical figures also saw their own doppelgangers. At number 5, we have another empress. The servants of the 18th century Empress of Russia, Catherine the Great, told her they saw her enter the throne room. She arose from her bed where she had been laying and went to see for herself. When she got there, she saw her doppelganger sitting calmly on the throne. It's written that she told her sentries to shoot at it, but whether or not it had any effect on the double isn't confirmed. Catherine herself died soon afterwards. So, could it be a harbinger of evil? Let's see with the next ones. At number 4, the other historical figure that saw her own double was Queen Elizabeth I. She claimed she saw her doppelganger lying still in her bed, like a corpse nearly. The experience is said to have been super haunting because, as I've said, seeing your double is rumored to be a premonition of death. And this was the case for the Queen possibly, as she did die soon after seeing the doppelganger lying in her bed. Number 3, Double Abe. So apparently the honest Abe had paranormal experiences as well. On the night of his first election, he sat on his couch and looked in the mirror. In it, he saw 2 faces. The second was another of his, but pale and ghastly. He stood up and it disappeared, but once he sat back down again, it appeared again. He was only startled, but his wife Mary was terrified and was convinced that it was a bad sign. She took it as a sign that he would be elected 2 terms. 2 terms because of the 2 faces. But she also predicted that he wouldn't survive the 2nd term because his doppelganger looked deathly. And as we know with history, he was elected for a 2nd time and also didn't make it through his 2nd term since he was assassinated. So Mary was very good at predictions. On to number 2, Double by the Trailer. So a man was helping his girlfriend clean out her grandmother's trailer after she had been moved into a nursing home. It was a complete mess. She had had cats, so the smell was horrid, and the place was basically used as their litter box. They even found kitten corpses throughout their cleaning. The woman he was seeing left to grab some more cleaning supplies because it was really that bad. The woman he was seeing left to grab some more cleaning supplies because it was just really that bad. While he was left alone, he found an animal skeleton with writing on it, and that really creeped him out. He said there was a stillness in the air and he was feeling quite cold, even though it was quite a hot day. Yeah, the air conditioning in the trailer didn't work, so he didn't really know what to make of it. He had to take a break to get his bearings. When the girl he was seeing returned, they did get back to work, but later on, when he was organizing things in the flatbed of the truck they rented, she called out, "What are you doing?" And so he answered her, "I'm just making sure the stuff in the flatbed is not gonna fall out," just kind of confused at her question. But when she heard him respond that, she screamed and ran out of the camper. She said she saw him behind the camper, and the version of him that she saw even turned and smiled at her, which is when she asked the question. So they left right away. Later on, when he went to visit her grandma at the nursing home for the first time, the grandmother screamed and asked him how he followed her there. But that was the first time they had ever met. So really, what was around that trailer, and how had it already been haunting the grandmother when it was his first time there? Does he have an evil twin? I want to know. Does he have an evil twin? Let me know down below. Okay, lastly, number 1, back from a dream. So a young girl stayed home from school when she was 9 to avoid school bullies, and she had a harrowing experience. She woke up from a nap on the couch and turned on the TV, and she was scrolling through some channels when her mother leans over a bar and just stares at her. Not speaking, just staring, emotionless. So she starts speaking to the mother figure, but it doesn't answer her. She kept trying to get it to respond to her, and it kept beckoning. The whole experience felt similar to a bad dream she had when she was younger, and it really got to her. She started screaming at it in hopes of some sort of reaction, but there was no change, so she ran. She ran to her real mother in the yard, who comforted her and told her it was just a fever dream. She was so scared because of her original bad dream. When she was just 6 or 7, she saw her mom's doppelganger in that dream. And in it, it stood over her real mother's sleeping body, and she tried to wake her mother but couldn't. So the doppelganger beckoned her and she followed because young children are trusting, and that's how she was at the time. But the double of her mom brought her through her house into a room that doesn't exist in her real one. It was just an all-white room, and there was a hulking, shadowy figure. So the doppelganger mom watched as the hulking, shadowy figure skinned her body with an axe. Her mom's doppelganger watched it happen in this dream, emotionless.
Starting off at number 10 now, we have Red. This one comes from Godzilla on Reddit. He said he once checked into a hotel a few kilometers from Kiev in Ukraine. It was very late and he was very tired. After booking a room at the desk, he was given a room number key. The woman at the desk stopped him as he went up the stairs. "One more thing," she said. "There is one room here without a number on that floor. It's always locked. Don't look in there." He nodded sleepily and headed upstairs, falling asleep instantly on his bed. He awoke though in the middle of the night to the sound of trickling water. It was coming from the room on the other side of the hallway. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the exact same one that had no number. He opened the door and saw the room opposite was the one that had no number. Ignoring the woman's advice, he banged on the door. No response. He tried again. No response. He looked in the keyhole and saw nothing but red, just a deep, hazy scarlet. The water was still trickling. He went down to the front desk to complain. The woman's face dropped. She told him slowly that there was nobody in that room ever since the murder. A woman was killed in there by her husband many years ago. Her skin was pale, her hair dark brown, and her eyes, when she died, were a red, a deep, hazy scarlet. Next up at number 9 now, we have Morse code. This one comes from Confra. He said he once lived in a small building in the middle of his city. He ended up moving out because of a strange man who lived across the hallway. The man mostly kept to himself, but around midnight there was always a strange noise coming from his apartment. It wasn't loud, but it was constant. It was a bumping sound, like someone walking around in heels, but muffled, as if someone was trying to keep it quiet. After a few days, he realized the pattern was always the same, like a record playing over and over again. It went on for weeks, then months, then almost a full year, always the same bumps for hours at night. It was only years later, living somewhere else, that something clicked. He was helping his daughter with homework. She was learning about Morse code. She knocked on the table with her knuckles and a shiver ran down his spine. He recognized it as the pattern he had heard all those years ago. When he asked her what it meant, she laughed. "That's the easiest one, Daddy," she said. "It's the one to call for help." Moving on to number 8 now, we have Charlie. This one comes from Reddit user Horror in Pure Form. I'm just going to read this one exactly as they wrote it because it really deserves it. "I hate it when my brother Charlie has to go away. My parents constantly try to explain to me how sick he is, that I am lucky for having a brain where all the chemicals flow properly to their destinations like undammed rivers. When I complain about how bored I am without a little brother to play with, they try to make me feel bad by pointing out that his boredom likely far surpasses mine, considering he's confined to a dark room in an institution. I always beg for them to give him one last chance. Of course, they did at first. Charlie has been back home several times, each shorter in duration than the last. Every time without fail, it all starts again. The neighborhood cats with gouged out eyes showing up in his toy chest, my dad's razors found dropped on the baby slide in the park across the street, mom's vitamins replaced by bits of dishwater tablets. My parents are hesitant now, using last chances sparingly. They say his disorder makes him charming, makes it easy for him to fake normalcy, and to trick doctors who care for him into thinking he is ready for rehabilitation, that I will just have to put up with my boredom if it means staying safe from him. I hate it when Charlie has to go away. It makes me have to pretend to be good until he is back." Next up at number 7 now, we have Counting. This one was submitted to BuzzFeed. A man said his daughter woke him before midnight one night. He and his wife had picked her up from her friend Sally's birthday party earlier that night, brought her home and put her to bed. His wife went into the bedroom to read to her while he fell asleep watching the game. He awoke to feel his daughter tugging on his shirt sleeve. "Daddy," she said, "guess how old I'm going to be next month?" "I don't know, honey," he said as he slipped on his glasses. "How old?" She smiled and held up 4 fingers. The parents stayed up all night asking their daughter the same question for hours, but she refused to tell them where she got those 4 fingers from. Moving on to number 6 now, we have Guardians. This is a story from Dark Alligator. One day, a man awoke to a huge insect-like creature looming over his bed. It twitched and jerked its head, staring right down at him. He screamed and ran out of the room. When he sheepishly came back though, the insect was gone. That didn't make sleeping again easier though, and he stayed up all night wondering if it was a dream. The next morning there was a knock at the door. He opened it to see one of the huge insects placing a plate filled with food on the floor. It then backed away from him. He ate the food, confused but content. Perhaps this was the beginning of a bizarre relationship? As well as cooking, the creatures poured baths for him and began to tuck him into bed. He began to worry they were fattening him up. After one greasy breakfast gave him heartburn though, they actually replaced it with fruit. It seemed that they cared about him. One night he awoke to gunshots and screaming. He raced downstairs to find a decapitated burglar being devoured by the insects. They were protecting him. One morning the creatures wouldn't let him leave his bedroom. He lay down on the bed, confused but trusting them. After hours of lying there, he felt a pain through his body. It felt like his stomach was full of razor wire and it was somehow moving. The insects chittered excitedly among themselves as his pain got worse. It was only when his skin began to bulge that he realized the insects hadn't been protecting him, they had been protecting their young. Moving on to number 5 now, we have The Sound of Silence. This one comes from Reddit user Doverhawk. She said after a lifetime of being deaf, her best friend just received cochlear implants. When he woke up from the surgery, they all stood around him. His wife was the first one to say anything. He heard her voice and at once began to cry. They all took turns speaking, letting him hear their voices and names, and with each word they said, he became more emotional. When they were all finished, silence hung in the room. He looked up at her and asked her what that sound was. It took a moment to understand what he was saying, and when she understood, she told him that he was hearing silence. He shook his head. "This isn't silence," he said slowly, hearing his own voice for the first time. "I've been hearing silence all my life, and this is different." A sound came from just outside the hospital room, and he perked up immediately. "Isn't that silence?" They all exchanged looks of trepidation around the room before she spoke. "No," she said slowly, "that was the sound of someone screaming." Moving on to number 4 now, we have Mother. This one comes from Reddit user Whoever Fights Monsters. She said that when she and her sister Betsy were kids, their family lived for a while in an old farmhouse. They loved exploring the dusty corners and climbing the apple tree in the backyard. Their favourite part was the ghost in the house. They named her Mother because she seemed kind and nurturing. Some mornings she and Betsy would wake up and find a cup of tea by their beds. They felt the ghost had left them there, worried that they would get thirsty in the night. Among the house's original furnishings was an antique wooden chair, which they kept against the back wall of the living room. Whenever they were watching TV or playing a game, Mother would inch the chair forward towards them. Sometimes she managed to move it all the way to the very middle of the room. They always felt sad putting it back against the wall, as they felt Mother just wanted to be near to them. Years later, long after they moved out, they found an old newspaper article about the farmhouse's original occupants. One of them was a widow who murdered her 2 children by giving them each a cup of poisoned milk before bed. Then she hung herself. The article included a photo of the farmhouse's living room with the woman's body hanging from a beam. Beneath her, knocked over, was the same old wooden chair placed right in the middle of the room. Next to number 3 now, we have the wallpaper. This one comes from Reddit user BatOutOfHell821. She said that her and her boyfriend once bought an old house. He took control of any new construction that was needed, converting the kitchen into the master bedroom for example. She was on wallpaper removal duty and had her work cut out. The previous owner had covered every single wall and ceiling. Removing it was a real chore, but she got into the rhythm of it eventually. It began to feel satisfying, like peeling off a sunburn. She began to play a game, seeing what the longest piece she could peel off was before it finally ripped. She noticed that under a corner section of paper in every single room was a person's name and a date. Curiosity got the better of her one night and she decided to Google one of the names and discovered that the person was actually a missing person. The name and the date matched perfectly. She didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, she made a list of all the names and dates. Her face got paler with each name that matched with a missing person. They called the police, who cornered off the whole area. She overheard 2 of the officers talking in one of the rooms. One said, "Yeah, it's definitely human." "Human?" she asked. "What's human?" "Ma'am," they said, "what you were peeling off the walls wasn't newspaper. We're going to give this all to the coroner." Next to number 2 now, we have Seeing Dad. This is a great story from the General G on Reddit. Real or not, it's very creepy, and he told it like this. "Every day I see my father at work. He pretends like he doesn't see me, but I know he does. I try to do the same. But that doesn't really pan out well either. When you're at work, you gotta be on top of your game. So I do my best to just get on with what I'm supposed to do and get my job done. I can feel him watching me me. Good. I want him to see how different I am from him. I'm not in your shadow. I'm my own person. I know what you're wondering. Do others know that he is my old man? Hard to say really. If they don't, I have no plans to correct them. If they do, well, there is nothing I can do about it. We are all under the shadow of our parents for the duration of most of our lives, whether we like it or not. In some cases, it just happens to be more obvious than others. Our parents help us define who we are. It's only a question of whether you follow their example or run as fast as you can in the other direction. For example, if you have a drug abusing parent who happens to murder a newlywed couple that gets stranded on the side of the road when you are only 10 years old, that might make one inclined to perpetuate a similar kind of violence, or it might make you decide to be a prison guard, so that you can make sure they and others just like them can't do it anymore, much like I did. And finally, number 1 now, we have Giggle. This is another one submitted to Reddit by a woman who said that one night she rushed out of her house to catch the opening act at her local bar's music night. After a few drinks, she realized her phone wasn't in her pocket. She checked the table that they were sitting at, it wasn't there. She tried the bar, the bathrooms, no luck. In the end, she gave up and decided to use her friend's phone to call her own. After 2 short rings, someone answered. "Hello?" she said. The other end of the line was silent. Then she heard a low, raspy giggle before the phone hung up. The person didn't answer again. She eventually decided to just go home. When she got to her bedroom, there she found her phone, lying on the table by her bed, right where she had left it.
Coming in at number 10, we have Die Greciet von Bison Frederick. Our next story translates to either cruel or wicked Frederick. I think it depends on what era you're born in, but this story is pretty much about a sociopath in the making. The story starts with cruel Frederick running around killing birds, just random birds that he finds. He finds them and he kills them and he rips their wings off. And this isn't even to eat them, he just wants to kill them for his own sick pleasure.
No, you need help. I need help?
Who does that? And the story only gets worse from there. He starts to destroy furniture and then he finds some poor lady named Mary and he starts whipping her. First of all, what is wrong with this kid? And second of all, why on earth does this kid have a whip? Who gives a kid a whip? Then there's a dog that shows up at this kid's house and he starts whipping the dog. And then the dog gets pissed and it mauls cruel Frederick's leg. And then the story ends with him in bed because his foot is infected and the dog is sitting at the dinner table eating his food. So I guess the moral of the story is don't be an evil child of Satan or you'll get attacked by wild animals and maybe starve to death. Next on the list we have Struwelpeter. This story translates to Shaggy Peter. And while being shaggy now in this day and age with ripped jeans and face tattoos is hip and cool, back when the story was written in 1845, they didn't feel the same way. Well, maybe that was just Germany. I don't know if there's a bunch of people running around with face tattoos in the 1800s in New England, who knows. But this story is about a boy who gets too damn shaggy. He never wants to groom himself, he has fingernails that grow super long and his hair needs to be brushed, but it's also so long because he never cuts it. Also, the story specifically talks about how he's covered in soot. I don't really think that's a problem anymore. I think the equivalent to being covered in soot is like being covered in Cheeto dust. The modern version of this story should be Cheeto Dust Charlie and the sticky fingers that ruined his Xbox controller. Someone in the comments please tell me how to say that in German. But pretty much what happens to old Shaggy Peter is that no one likes him. He stinks, he's hairy, he's got fingernails so long he could scratch his next door neighbor's ear holes. So the moral of the old tale is be clean or people won't like you. In 1845, we hadn't started telling kids that it's what's on the inside that counts.
You're ugly.
Coming in at number 8, we have Fidgety Phillips. This story is a warning to kids who can't sit still at the dinner table. But before I dive into this one, don't forget to like this video. The story goes that young Philip is at the dinner table with his parents and is being pretty rambunctious. Eventually, after moving around way too much, he ends up tipping his chair over. In his fall, he ends up bringing the entire dinner table and everything on it down with him and makes a complete mess. He is under the tablecloth with all of the dinner scraps over top and all around him. His parents are of course extremely upset at him for ruining all their plates and glasses and the dinner that they had made for everyone. The boy ended up not getting to eat dinner and had to go hungry that day. If you take anything from this story, just make sure you're minding your manners at the dinner table. Moving on to our number 7 spot, we have the story of Augustus who wouldn't have any soup. This story is about a boy named Augustus who was a healthy little boy with round cheeks. Augustus never had a problem eating and also ate whatever he was told to and never let his soup get cold. But one winter day, something changed in Augustus. When his soup was placed in front of him that day, he threw a tantrum and refused to eat it. He threw his spoon across the room and yelled to get that nasty soup away from him. The next day he was visibly thinner from not getting his nutrients, but he still refused to eat his soup. The next day the same thing, and the days that followed. He was withering away in front of everyone's eyes. On the fourth day he was so thin he hardly outweighed a sugar plum. The story takes a dark turn on the fifth day when he ends up being found dead.
And number 6, we have Die Griechet von Fliegenden Robert. This one is the story of Flying Robert. He goes out during a rainy day and he has his umbrella and he ends up floating away. And the last line of the story is literally, he was never seen again. The moral of the story is to tell kids not to go outside when it's gross and rainy outside, but how harsh does the story have to be? The kid couldn't just come home with a cold and get a little sick and then get better. No, he had to float away from the wind, picking him up by his umbrella, and then he would vanish from society. Jesus.
In our number 5 spot, we have the girl without hands story. This story is about a father who gets offered money by a strange man. The man tells the father that if he gives him whatever is standing behind the mill, then he will give him the money. Unbeknownst to the father, this strange man is actually the devil. The man agrees because he believes that there is only an apple tree standing behind the mill, but to his unfortunate surprise, his daughter was actually standing behind it. When the devil goes to take the daughter away, she fights back. She is so pure that she is able to resist his grip, but the devil still wants to take something with him. He tells the father and daughter that he will leave if the father will chop off his daughter's hands to give to him. Of course, at first they said absolutely not, but then the devil threatened to take the father away if they didn't agree. So unfortunately, that father and daughter had no choice and were forced to chop off her hands. I definitely don't want to go to sleep after hearing that one.
And number 4, we have Die Griechet von den Wilden Jäger. Also, if I'm pronouncing these wrong, I want to apologize to everyone watching the video. This translates to the story of the Wild Huntsman. This is a tale about a dude who wanted to head out and hunt some rabbit for his dinner. While he was out hunting, the day gets super hot and this dude was like, why should I hunt in the sun when I can just take a nap and start hunting again later? Smart dude. Well, it turns out not so smart. When he was sleeping, the rabbit steals his gun and his glasses and then starts shooting at him. He starts running away in terror because the rabbit is trying to kill him and he can barely see without his glasses. The huntsman manages to run back to his cottage where his wife is waiting for him. His wife hears a ton of commotion and comes out to see her husband being hunted by a rodent. In a final attempt to survive, the huntsman jumps down a well and his wife screams in terror and drops her coffee on her foot and burns herself, and the rabbit and the rabbit's baby celebrate. I don't even know what the moral of the story is. Don't sleep on the job or animals will gain sentience and try to murder you in front of your loved ones?
In our number 3 spot, we have Max and Moritz. This story is about 2 little rascals who like to pull pranks. In the story, they pull off 7 different pranks. Some of their pranks include stealing a widow's chicken, breaking a bridge and then making the tailor walk over it so that he falls into the river below, and filling a teacher's pipe with gunpowder so that when he lights it, it blows up in his face. Needless to say, these boys are pretty reckless and pretty cruel. Eventually, someone decides it's time to prank the boys back, but this is where things take an even darker turn. This prank ends up being less of a prank and more of an extremely severe punishment. The boys end up getting baked into bread and fed to the chickens. I can't believe that this is actually a story told to children. The boys did play some pretty harmful pranks, but I'm not sure if this extent was necessary. I guess it's a lesson to be kind and treat others well.
At number 2, we have Die Göttore Griechet mi Frühzig. There's my German. I'm killing it. Killing it at German today. My German's the best. This translates to a very sad story with matches. And it's about a girl named Harriet who is left home alone. Her parents have a box of matches on the countertop and tell her not to touch them, but this little girl loves fire. And so the girl doesn't listen to her parents and she lights a match anyways. And then her clothes light on fire and she burns until there's nothing left but her smoldering ashes on the ground. And then her cats cry a stream stream of tears out of their face, and that's the end. That's the end of the story. The lesson is obviously don't play with matches, and the secret message is how you give a child a lifelong fear of fire.
In our number 1 spot today, we have the story of Little Suck a Thumb. This story starts off with a mom leaving her young son Conrad at home. She explains that she needs to leave for a little while, but warns him not to suck his thumb while she is away or else. She says that the great tall tailor always finds little boys who suck their thumbs and takes big sharp scissors and cuts them off, and explains that thumbs can't grow back. The mom leaves, and then almost immediately after, the boy begins sucking his thumb. He had been warned, but absolutely did not listen. Soon, the door flew open and a tailor began running in with scissors. I'm not sure why the tailor cares so much about it, but he ends up chasing the boy around and snipping off his thumbs. When the mom comes home, she sees the boy standing there, and apparently he just looks sad. I feel like I would be a lot more than sad if somebody cut off my thumbs, but I guess it is just a story. The mom then says she knew that the tailor would come to naughty little Suck a Thumb, which seems like kind of an insensitive response.